When the HOA tried to take my land, they thought I was just another quiet homeowner. But buried deep inside a stack of forgotten county documents lay one line, one simple legal detail, that would turn everything upside down. This isn't just a story about property. It's about power, pride, and revenge. It started on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where the world feels calm before a storm you don't yet see coming. The sun was rising over the quiet suburban street, rows of identical houses lining the cul-de-sac, each one painted in regulation-approved beige. Everything here looked perfect, painfully perfect. For 5 years, I'd lived at the end of that street, on the edge of the neighborhood, where my backyard opened up into a patch of wooded land. It wasn't much, maybe 2 acres, but it was mine. I kept it trimmed, cleared, and peaceful. My small shed sat near the back fence, where I kept tools and a few old boxes from my late father. It wasn't fancy, but it was honest. That morning, I noticed something strange taped to my front door. A bright orange slip fluttered in the wind, stamped with the official HOA logo, bold letters that already made my stomach tighten. The notice was short, but it carried the kind of arrogance that only a homeowners association could muster. According to them, my backyard extension had violated property boundaries, and I was required to remove all non-approved structures immediately. At first, I laughed. A mistake, I thought. The shed had been there for years, long before I even moved in. But as I read the fine print, my pulse began to quicken. They claimed that a portion of my land wasn't actually mine. That the HOA had jurisdiction over it, and that I was, essentially, trespassing on community property. I remember standing in that driveway, the paper trembling in my hand as my neighbors jogged past, pretending not to look. This wasn't a mistake. It was a message. Over the next few days, the tone escalated. More letters arrived, each one colder than the last. Fines. Warnings. Deadlines. The HOA president, a woman named Margaret Dunn, the type who lived for control, began stopping by to inspect. She'd take photos, clipboards in hand, muttering about non-compliance. I knew her type. The kind that believed power came from paperwork and fear. But what she didn't know was that I didn't scare easily. Still, the pressure built. Notices turned into threats of legal action. The HOA board even hinted at repossession, claiming they'd reclaim the disputed portion of land if I didn't comply. The word reclaim echoed in my head. How could someone reclaim something they never owned? That night, I went out to the shed and ran my hand across the rough wooden door. This place wasn't just storage, it was history. My father built it before the HOA even existed. Every plank of wood had his fingerprints on it. Losing it wasn't an option. I decided to dig deeper. If the HOA claimed part of my property wasn't mine, I wanted to see proof. The next morning, I drove down to the county records office, a dusty old building filled with filing cabinets that probably hadn't been touched in years. The clerk looked at me strangely when I asked for land deeds and property maps dating back more than 30 years. But after a long wait, she handed over a folder, thin, faded, but heavy with answers. Inside were old maps, surveys, and handwritten notes from the county surveyor. I traced the lines with my finger, boundaries drawn long before the HOA had ever formed. And there, in the corner of one page, almost invisible under a coffee stain, was something that caught my eye, a handwritten amendment from 1987. It stated that the rear portion of my lot, the very area the HOA claimed, was exempt from future association oversight. It was private property, protected under a grandfather clause. A smile crept across my face. The HOA hadn't read this part. They didn't even know it existed. But instead of rushing home to confront them, I decided to stay quiet. Let them dig their own hole first. Over the following week, Margaret kept pushing. More letters. More fines. One afternoon, I saw her taking photos again, standing just past my fence line. I didn't stop her. Let her gather her evidence. I wanted them to feel confident, unstoppable, right up until the moment I pulled the ground out from under them. By the time the HOA announced an official meeting to resolve the dispute, I had everything ready. Every document, every signature, every map from the county archive. I was no longer just defending my land, I was preparing for war. As I laid the papers out across my kitchen table that night, the clock ticking past midnight, I realized something. This wasn't just about me. The HOA had bullied dozens of neighbors, fining them for lawn colors, mailbox heights, and parking spots. But no one had ever fought back. That was about to change. I looked out through the window into the darkness of my backyard. The trees stood silent, steady, my quiet witnesses. They had stood long before Margaret and her rules, and they would stand long after she was gone. The battle lines were drawn. Next week's meeting wasn't going to be another HOA power trip. It was going to be their downfall. And I was going to make sure everyone in that room saw exactly what happens when you underestimate the man who reads the fine print. The day of the HOA meeting arrived with a strange heaviness in the air. Even before I stepped out of the house, I could feel it, that quiet tension that hangs before a storm breaks. The neighborhood looked normal on the surface, trimmed lawns, neat hedges, polite smiles. But behind those smiles were whispers, and behind those whispers was fear. Everyone knew Margaret Dunn didn't like to be challenged. She ran the HOA like a small kingdom, and anyone who questioned her authority quickly found themselves fined, silenced, or worse, ostracized. People had seen it happen before, and no one wanted to be next. But this time was different. This time, she'd picked a fight with the wrong man. The meeting was held at the community center, a sterile, beige room with folding chairs and a long table up front where the board members sat, their faces a mix of smugness and forced professionalism. A large HOA banner hung behind them, like they were hosting some kind of courtroom instead of a neighborhood discussion. Margaret sat in the center seat, her posture rigid, a stack of printed papers at her side. Her lips were pressed so tightly together it looked like she was trying to hold in a smile, that smug, self-satisfied smile of someone who thought they'd already won. As I walked in, the chatter died down. Heads turned. Some neighbors looked away, others gave small nods of encouragement. They wanted to see how this played out, even if they didn't dare say it aloud. Margaret cleared her throat, tapping her pen against a clipboard. "We're here today to address ongoing violations regarding Lot 42, she began, her tone rehearsed, cold, and official. Specifically, the unauthorized structure and land use extending beyond community limits. The way she said unauthorized made it sound criminal. I could almost hear the pride in her voice. She flipped through a few papers dramatically, reading off fine amounts, regulation numbers, and property codes. Each one sounded more absurd than the last, lines designed to sound authoritative, but hollow once you actually understood the law. Then came the final line: as of today, the board has voted to proceed with reclamation of the disputed property area. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some looked shocked. Others looked at me with pity. They thought I was finished. Margaret leaned back, confident. "Do you have anything you'd like to say before we finalize this?" I didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, I placed a thin manila folder on the table in front of me. Slowly, calmly. The sound of the paper sliding across the wood seemed louder than anything else in the room. Margaret frowned. "If you have documents, they'll be reviewed later." But she stopped when she saw the seal. The faded blue county emblem stamped in the corner. I stood up. My voice was calm, deliberate, the tone of someone who knows exactly what he's holding. "Before you make your final decision," I said evenly, "you might want to see the actual deed of this property. Not the HOA's version. The original version." The room went still. I opened the folder and spread the papers across the table. Old survey maps. County letters. A notarized amendment from 1987. I let the dates speak for themselves. "This," I continued, pointing to the handwritten note in faded ink, "was filed years before this HOA even existed. It clearly states that the rear 2 acres of Lot 42 are exempt from any and all association oversight. Meaning your board has no legal authority over that land." Margaret's face went pale. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. I could feel the crowd's energy shift, the tension turning into curiosity, even awe. People leaned forward. They were seeing something they'd never witnessed before, someone standing up to the HOA and winning. One of the board members, a quiet man named Richard, reached for the paper, scanning the clause with furrowed brows. His expression said everything. He knew it was real. He knew they were done. Margaret tried to recover. This can't be valid," she stammered. "That document is outdated." "It's filed, recorded, and still in effect," I interrupted. "You didn't read the fine print, Margaret. You assumed control where you had none. And now, not only are your fines invalid, but your attempted reclamation could be considered an illegal action under property law." Her jaw tightened. The arrogance drained from her face, replaced by a flicker of panic. The silence that followed was thick. Even the air conditioner seemed to stop humming. Neighbors began whispering among themselves. Some were smiling now, trying to hide it. A few even clapped quietly before Margaret slammed her clipboard down, trying to regain order. "This meeting is adjourned," she barked, her voice cracking. "We'll review this through proper legal channels." But the damage was done. As people filed out, I could feel their glances, a mix of respect and disbelief. One man muttered, "Finally, someone put her in her place." Another whispered, "He actually did it." When I reached the parking lot, the cool night air hit me like freedom. The moon hung low over the neighborhood, the same one I'd fought to protect. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the rush of knowing I'd just shifted the balance of power. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Margaret wasn't the kind to surrender quietly. People like her didn't admit defeat, they plotted their revenge behind closed doors, in emails, in technicalities. Sure enough, 2 days later, a certified letter arrived in my mailbox. It was from the HOA's legal representative, formal, sterile, and predictable. They were reviewing my documents for validity. Translation: they were looking for any loophole they could exploit. I almost laughed. They were walking straight into their own trap. Because what they didn't realize was that the fine print didn't just protect my land, it exposed theirs. As I stood in my kitchen, letter in hand, I looked again at the county map I'd copied. There was something curious about the boundaries, a small error, maybe overlooked for decades. But it wasn't in my favor this time. It was in theirs. The HOA's own clubhouse, the pride of their neighborhood, sat partially on land that technically didn't belong to them either. And suddenly, I knew exactly how to end this, not by defending myself, but by showing the entire community what the HOA really was, a fraud built on arrogance and ignorance. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. The night I discovered the boundary error, I barely slept. My kitchen table was covered in maps, county deeds, and decades-old zoning records, the kind of dusty paper trail most people would never bother to read. But that was their mistake. The HOA, for all their arrogance, had built their power on assumptions. They'd never checked the foundation they were standing on. And now, I had proof that the ground beneath them wasn't theirs at all. The more I studied the county plat maps, the clearer it became. A thin black line, barely visible, marked the original survey boundary from the 1980s. But a later map, the one the HOA used, showed a slightly different line. It looked insignificant, just a few feet over. But when scaled across the entire neighborhood, that line shifted nearly 30 yards east. And right across that shifted line sat the HOA clubhouse. Their prized building, the one where they held all their meetings, collected dues, and handed out fines, was built partially on a strip of land that wasn't legally theirs. According to the original record, that small strip still belonged to the county. Not private land. Not HOA property. Public land. I stared at it for a long moment, realizing the irony. They'd spent weeks trying to take my property, but all along, they'd been sitting on stolen ground themselves. The next morning, I went back to the county records office, armed with copies and questions. The same clerk was there, an older woman with glasses perched low on her nose. When I pointed out the discrepancy, she frowned, then pulled out a newer digital survey on her computer. After a few clicks, she looked up, surprised. "You're right," she said. "This portion here shouldn't have been transferred to the HOA when the neighborhood was formed. It's still under county ownership. Probably a clerical oversight from when they filed their charter." Her words confirmed everything. The HOA's power was built on paper, and that paper was wrong. I thanked her, made copies of everything, and drove home with a plan forming in my mind. I didn't want revenge for revenge's sake. I wanted justice, and I wanted every family in that neighborhood to finally see what kind of people they were dealing with. But I knew Margaret wouldn't back down easily. She'd double down, just like every petty tyrant does when the truth corners them. So I had to be smart. The first step was exposure. I drafted a short letter to every homeowner in the neighborhood. Nothing dramatic, just facts. I included copies of the county map, highlighted the boundary, and attached the deed clause that proved the HOA had no jurisdiction over my land. Then, in one clean paragraph, I explained how the HOA's own property stood on land that didn't legally belong to them. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. That weekend, I slipped the letters quietly into every mailbox after midnight. The next morning, the street buzzed like a beehive. By noon, people were outside, talking in hushed tones. Some gathered in small clusters on driveways, holding the papers, shaking their heads. I watched from my porch, unseen, as confusion turned into outrage. Years of frustration, fines, restrictions, petty rules, all bubbling to the surface. By that evening, I started getting texts. First from neighbors I barely knew. Then from people who'd once avoided me, afraid of Margaret's retaliation. They thanked me, cautiously, asking if it was true. I confirmed it. Then I sent them copies of the official county seal. By sunset, word had reached Margaret. She stormed down the street like a thundercloud, red-faced and shaking, holding one of the letters in her hand. I watched from inside as she stopped in front of my house, glancing at my windows, trying to decide whether to knock. But she didn't. Instead, she turned on her heel and marched away, her phone already at her ear. The next day, the HOA sent out a mass email dismissing the rumors. They claimed the documents were inaccurate, that anonymous parties were spreading misinformation. But it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing fast. For years, the board had ruled through fear, empty threats, fines, and bureaucratic bullying. But fear only works as long as people believe in the authority behind it. Now, that illusion was cracking. Within a week, several homeowners demanded a special audit of the HOA's records. They wanted transparency. Financials, property titles, everything. Margaret tried to block it, calling it disruptive. But the pressure was mounting. Even her loyal board members were beginning to waver. One evening, I stood on my back porch, looking toward the distant glow of the clubhouse lights. It was quiet, except for the hum of crickets and the faint echo of voices from a late-night board meeting. They were desperate now, trying to hold their crumbling empire together. But the truth had momentum, and once it started rolling, there was no stopping it. 2 days later, the county's land management department arrived in the neighborhood with survey equipment. Official vehicles parked near the clubhouse. County inspectors began measuring property lines, referencing the same documents I'd uncovered. The sight of them was enough to draw half the neighborhood out of their homes. People gathered on sidewalks, phones in hand, watching as the inspectors walked the perimeter. Margaret stood nearby, trying to stay composed, but the look on her face told the whole story. When the lead inspector finally spoke, his words carried across the quiet street. He confirmed publicly what I already knew: part of the clubhouse was built on county land, not HOA property. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Someone clapped. Someone else laughed. For the first time in years, the HOA looked powerless. That night, my phone buzzed nonstop: messages, screenshots, even local news inquiries. The story had spread faster than I imagined. The untouchable HOA had built their empire on land that wasn't theirs. Margaret sent one last letter to every homeowner that week, dripping with forced formality. It promised a resolution soon and assured everyone that corrective actions were being taken. But by then, no one believed her anymore. I'd lit a fire that couldn't be put out. And yet, I knew Margaret wasn't finished. People like her never surrender, they scheme. They wait for a way to strike back, not with truth, but with manipulation. And sure enough, as I walked to my mailbox one chilly morning, I saw it, a new envelope. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was from the county courthouse. Inside was a summons. Margaret had filed a lawsuit. Not against the HOA, not even on behalf of it, but personally against me. For defamation and distribution of falsified property documents. The paper shook slightly in my hand, but not from fear. From adrenaline. She'd just escalated this to a level she couldn't control. This wasn't just a neighborhood feud anymore. It was a full-blown war. The morning I received the lawsuit, the air outside felt different, sharper, colder, heavier. It wasn't fear that filled me. It was clarity. Margaret's move wasn't about justice. It was desperation dressed as confidence. When people like her start to lose control, they swing blindly, hoping intimidation can do what authority no longer can. The summons was formal, full of legal jargon that boiled down to one thing: she was accusing me of lying. According to her, my documents were fraudulent and had damaged the reputation of the HOA. The irony almost made me laugh. The woman who'd tried to steal my land was now claiming I had tarnished her good name. But beneath that arrogance was something else, a fatal mistake. By filing this case in court, she'd opened the door for a full legal review. Every document, every map, every HOA policy would now be subject to public record. She'd just dragged her own skeletons into the light. I contacted an attorney, a quiet, steady man named Hayes who'd spent decades handling property disputes. He wasn't flashy, but he was methodical. When I laid the documents across his desk, his eyebrows lifted. "She really didn't read the fine print," he said, almost in disbelief. "You've got her cornered. But don't gloat yet. People like her, they don't lose gracefully." He was right. Margaret didn't back down. She doubled down. Over the next few weeks, she paraded around the neighborhood as if nothing had happened. She told anyone who'd listen that I'd faked the records, that she'd have me exposed in court. She even posted a statement on the HOA's community board accusing me of spreading misinformation. But while she was busy talking, I was busy building something far more dangerous, a paper wall she couldn't climb. I gathered every official record, county filings, property transfers, HOA charters, and emails she'd sent to homeowners. I'd even requested copies of her communications with the county over the years. What I found was a goldmine, and it wasn't just about the land. Hidden in one of the email chains was a message Margaret had sent 2 years earlier to a contractor, authorizing minor construction adjustments to expand the HOA clubhouse onto the same land she didn't legally own. There it was, in black and white. Proof she'd known, or should have known, that the land wasn't theirs. When the day of the hearing arrived, the courtroom was packed. Not just with lawyers and witnesses, but with curious neighbors. Word had spread like wildfire. Everyone wanted to see how it ended. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by her attorney, a young, overconfident man in a navy suit who looked like he'd been paid more for his posture than his experience. She wore a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind that cracked under pressure. The judge, an older man with a calm, steady voice, began by asking both sides for opening statements. Margaret's lawyer spoke first, reciting lines about defamation, public harm, and malicious intent. It sounded rehearsed, but hollow. When it was our turn, Hayes stood. He didn't dramatize it. He simply walked to the center of the courtroom and laid the original property deed on the evidence table. This, he said, his tone measured and deliberate, is the fine print my client was accused of fabricating. It's an official, certified document, recorded with the county decades before the HOA was even established. It clearly states that the rear portion of Lot 42 is exempt from association oversight. The plaintiff's claim that she had authority over that land is not only incorrect, it's unlawful. Margaret shifted uncomfortably. Her lawyer tried to object, but the judge motioned for him to sit. Hayes continued. Furthermore, we have documentation from the county proving that the HOA's own clubhouse was constructed partially on county land, a fact the plaintiff either ignored or deliberately concealed. And here, he held up a printed email, is her written authorization for that construction. The room fell silent. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. This case, Hayes said, isn't about defamation. It's about accountability. Margaret's composure began to crack. Her lawyer tried to redirect, claiming the documents were outdated, that I'd manipulated public opinion. But the judge interrupted him with a calm, pointed question. Counselor, are you suggesting the county's official records are falsified? The lawyer stammered. And no, Your Honor, but... Then you're suggesting your client failed to verify the records before making legal threats? There was no answer. Only silence. One by one, the pieces fell into place. The judge examined the maps, the dates, the emails. Each one was a nail in the coffin of Margaret's credibility. By the time Hayes rested our case, there was no saving her. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was steady and final. The court finds in favor of the defendant. The plaintiff's claims of defamation are dismissed. Furthermore, the evidence suggests the HOA acted beyond its legal authority. The county may wish to review this matter further. Margaret froze, staring at the desk as if she could will the words away. But they stayed. The decision was final. The room buzzed with quiet murmurs. Some of the neighbors in the back exchanged glances, their faces lighting with restrained satisfaction. Others shook their heads in disbelief. The invincible HOA president had just been publicly dismantled, not by anger or defiance, but by her own ignorance. Afterward, as people filed out, I stayed behind for a moment, watching Margaret pack her papers. Her hands trembled, and the confidence she once carried like armor was gone. When she finally looked up, her eyes met mine, not with hatred, but disbelief. The kind of look a person gives when they realize they've become their own undoing. Outside the courthouse, the air felt lighter than it had in months. Hayes clapped me on the shoulder and smiled. That, he said, was the cleanest takedown I've seen in years. But even as I smiled, I knew the fight wasn't fully over. The judge's verdict had done more than protect me, it had triggered something far bigger. The county was now aware of the HOA's illegal construction. And the state could step in next. As I drove home, the neighborhood looked different. Neighbors waved. Kids played freely again. The air of control and fear that had hung over the community for years had begun to fade. But inside the clubhouse, that half-illegal monument of HOA arrogance, a storm was brewing. Margaret's fall wasn't just personal. It was political. And power vacuums never stay empty for long. A new board would soon rise, and they'd remember one thing clearly: the man who read the fine print had changed everything. When the gavel struck and the judge's words echoed through the courtroom, the HOA's arrogance shattered like glass. What once stood as a powerful board that dictated every move in the neighborhood was now reduced to a group of speechless, red-faced members who couldn't look anyone in the eye. The ruling was clear: the HOA had no legal claim over my property. Every fine, every threat, every notice they'd sent was not only invalid but classified as harassment. The court didn't just dismiss their case, it turned the entire matter back on them. As I walked out of the courtroom, the world outside felt different, brighter, quieter, and free. For the first time in months, the weight of their constant surveillance, their letters, their fines, and their attempts to humiliate me was gone. The victory wasn't just legal, it was deeply personal. I'd stood up against a system built to intimidate homeowners, and I'd won, not through rage, not through revenge, but through patience and the law they never bothered to read. News of the verdict spread faster than I expected. Neighbors who once avoided me now stopped by to congratulate me. Some admitted they'd faced similar treatment but were too afraid to speak up. Others said they finally felt safe enough to question the HOA's power. The once untouchable board had become a cautionary tale, a symbol of greed exposed by the very man they tried to break. Meanwhile, the HOA president, Janet, vanished from public view. She resigned quietly, leaving a vague statement about needing time to reflect. But rumors spread quickly that she'd been removed by the rest of the board after the legal defeat cost them thousands in court fees and refunds. Their insurance barely covered the damages, and the members now faced the anger of the very residents they'd ruled over. For once, they were the ones cornered by the consequences of their own arrogance. Despite my victory, I didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in seeing people humiliated, only relief that the truth had finally been seen. But I did make one thing clear. I sent a letter, not to threaten, but to remind them that justice had spoken. My property is mine, I wrote. And no one, not even a board of self-proclaimed enforcers, has the right to take that away. It was the closure I needed after months of fear and frustration. But beneath that calm, a storm still lingered. A few board members hadn't accepted defeat. They couldn't stand the idea that someone like me, an ordinary homeowner, had outsmarted them. Late at night, I noticed cars slowing down near my house. Anonymous notes appeared in my mailbox, petty, childish attempts to intimidate me once more. But now, I wasn't the same man they'd once pushed around. Every message, every visit, every shadow caught on camera was documented and reported. This time, I wasn't playing defense. I was ready to protect what was rightfully mine, with proof, not emotion. In a twist of irony, the HOA's downfall began to ripple beyond my neighborhood. Other homeowners in nearby communities heard about the case. They began pulling their own property deeds, reading the fine print just as I had. Some discovered similar overreaches, restrictions that had no legal ground, fines that were never enforceable. My story had sparked something far greater than a single victory. It had become a symbol, proof that standing your ground and knowing your rights could topple even the most intimidating authority. Weeks later, I walked along the edge of my land, the same boundary line that had once sparked months of chaos. The wind carried the soft scent of pine, and the silence was peaceful. I looked at the old marker stone I'd found during my research, the one that confirmed my property's limits. It was a reminder that history, patience, and truth had all been on my side. The HOA had underestimated the one thing they couldn't control, knowledge. Still, part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over. The HOA board might have been defeated, but pride rarely dies quietly. Their reputations were ruined, their authority shattered, and people like Janet didn't fade away without trying to reclaim power. Somewhere in the background, I could sense the tension, a quiet anger building among those who'd lost their control. One morning, a new notice appeared on my door, not from the HOA, but from a private law firm. A civil claim, filed under a different name, yet suspiciously familiar in tone. It alleged property encroachment and disturbance of neighborhood standards. The handwriting on the attached note gave it away. It was Janet's. She was back, and she wasn't done. This wasn't about property anymore. It was about revenge. The second lawsuit wasn't just a legal attack, it was a message. Janet wasn't trying to win this time, she was trying to wear me down. To drag me through court again, drain my resources, and make me regret ever standing up to her. The new claim was thinner than paper, built on false accusations and twisted half-truths. But she'd chosen the wrong man to test twice. This time, I wasn't angry. I was prepared. Every document, every photo, every record of HOA harassment was already archived and ready to use. I had learned their patterns, intimidation through bureaucracy, fear through fines, and control through confusion. But what Janet didn't understand was that when you've already lost everything once, you stop being afraid of losing again. The legal process started slowly, just as she wanted. Her lawyers filed motion after motion, stalling the hearing, forcing me to appear again and again. Each time, she'd show up in the back of the courtroom, sitting quietly, watching me, not as a board president anymore, but as a bitter woman obsessed with control. Her smile wasn't victory, it was denial. But outside the courtroom, the story had changed. Word of the first case had spread far beyond our neighborhood. A local reporter picked it up, a homeowner who defeated an HOA through a forgotten clause in an old deed. Soon, it was everywhere: HOA forums, legal blogs, even YouTube channels that specialized in exposing corruption. By the time the second case rolled in, the world was already watching. That attention became my shield. Every hearing, every filing, every document was public record. The law firm representing her realized they'd walked into a storm they couldn't contain. Her lies weren't just falling apart, they were being dissected online. What she thought would destroy me became her own undoing. And then, the turning point came. During discovery, my attorney uncovered an internal HOA email chain, one Janet had tried to delete. It showed her plan from the beginning, to pressure me into compliance using intimidation and legal exhaustion. The words were hers. That one email changed everything. The judge didn't just dismiss the new case, he referred it for investigation. Harassment, abuse of authority, and potential fraud in HOA operations. Suddenly, it wasn't me who had to defend myself. It was Janet. The fallout was swift and brutal. The State Housing Authority launched an audit. Former HOA members turned on her, handing over documents to save themselves. The community that once feared her began to demand answers. Fines she'd issued to others were refunded, and her personal assets came under scrutiny. In a matter of weeks, she went from ruling over an entire neighborhood to standing alone, surrounded by the wreckage of her own empire. I didn't attend the final hearing. I didn't need to. Justice had already done what I couldn't. Instead, I stayed home, sitting on the porch that had once been at the center of so much conflict. The land stretched quietly before me, the same land they'd tried to take, the same boundaries they'd sworn weren't mine. The evening air felt lighter, and for the first time, the silence wasn't heavy with fear or tension. It was peaceful. A few weeks later, I received a letter in the mail. Not from a lawyer, not from the HOA, but from Janet herself. Handwritten. Short. It said, "You won." I was wrong. No apology, no explanation, just those 6 words. And strangely, that was enough. The HOA was dissolved a month later. A new neighborhood committee replaced it, smaller, transparent, and powerless to interfere with private property. People started planting flowers again, repainting fences, and talking to one another. The tension that had hung over every street corner vanished. The community finally belonged to the people who lived in it, not to those who ruled it. Standing at the edge of my property one last time, I thought back to the moment it all began, a simple notice on my door, a demand from people who thought they owned what they didn't. They hadn't read the fine print then, and in the end, it was that same fine print that destroyed them. Because power without understanding is fragile. And arrogance, when left unchecked, always writes its own ending. The land that almost cost me everything now stood as proof, not just of ownership, but of resilience. They tried to take my land, but what they really lost was their control. And that was the real victory.